My sister-in-law tried to erase my entire life, but I discovered a secret that changed everything. At first, it seemed like life was just asking me for patience. I told myself it was all a phase, that it would soon pass, and that I just had to take a deep breath and not make trouble. But the feeling of suffocation grew day by day. After my mother's death, the house I lived in no longer had the same smell, the same sound, or the same rhythm. Everything that had once been welcoming became heavy, as if the air had grown denser. Little by little, I realized that the void she left would not be filled with affection or togetherness, but with control. Silence became my refuge, but also my prison. I avoided conflict, believing that if I kept quiet, perhaps things would resolve themselves. The problem was that, in this silence, I was letting my voice disappear. Let me introduce myself. My name is Leticia, and at the time, I was 22 years old. I was in the early stages of adulthood, trying to find my place in the world, but still very dependent on my family structure. I attended college at night and worked in a simple office during the day, which gave me the feeling that I was building something for myself. Before my mother died, I felt secure, because even in the face of financial difficulties, I had an emotional foundation that sustained me. My mother was the foundation of everything, the one who dried my tears, the one who encouraged me to keep going. When she passed, what remained was an abyss that seemed to grow ever wider within me. The big turning point, however, didn't happen immediately. First, it was the silent arrival of my sister-in-law, Marta, who, with her calm speech and firm manner, gradually gained ground. At first, it seemed positive. She organized the house, helped my father, Celso, navigate the daily grind, and always had a word of common sense to resolve conflicts. But over time, I realized that this common sense was just a facade. Behind it lay manipulation, emotional blackmail, and a calculated way to divide us. My father, still fragile from the loss, clung to her as if she were a savior. For him, Marta was the only one capable of keeping the family afloat. I, on the other hand, became just the fragile daughter who needed guidance. My brother Renato, married to Marta, seemed blind. He always defended his wife, even when she subtly humiliated me, with small phrases that gradually eroded my self-esteem. "You're hopeless," she'd say with a smile that fooled outsiders. "Your mother spoiled you with so much pampering," she'd add in front of my father, who just sighed as if it were true. I didn't know if her contempt or his silence hurt more. Every family dinner was a test of endurance. I'd leave the table feeling like I'd shrunk a little more, that my voice was fading within those walls. It was in this scenario that I realized how control was taking hold. Marta alienated my cousin Nade, who had always been my rock. With intrigue and lies, she made my father believe Nade had bad intentions, only to further isolate me. At first, I tried to resist. I sent messages and arranged secret meetings, but soon I was caught in the web of distrust Marta had created. She always had a way of turning the tables, painting me as ungrateful or disloyal. I began to believe I was truly alone. And in this isolation, a question haunted me. How do you fight when everyone around you believes you're the weaker party? Time passed, and I no longer recognized the person I saw in the mirror. Before, I was talkative, dreamy, full of plans. Now, my routine was limited to surviving without attracting attention, as if I were a ghost in my own house. I avoided conversations, kept quiet in arguments, and swallowed words that burned inside me. When I was alone in my room, I cried softly, so no one would hear. It was as if each day I faded a little more. My mother's absence weighed even more heavily in those moments, because I knew that if she were there, she wouldn't allow that to happen. But she wasn't. And deep down, I felt like I was betraying her memory by allowing them to treat me that way. I even considered giving up on everything. Not in the most extreme sense of the word, but giving up the fight, giving up on asserting myself. Let them talk, I told myself. There's no point in trying. They'll never see me as I truly am. But this resignation was painful. It was like living trapped in a distorted version of myself, shaped by Marta's words and actions. I didn't want to believe that this would be my life, but I was too tired to fight. It was at this point that I began to wonder if I had any value, if there was something in me truly worth defending. The loneliness was so great that I almost believed in the fragile image she had constructed of me. With each passing day, Marta's attacks grew bolder. They were no longer just insinuations or veiled comments. She began making decisions for me. interfering in how I spent my money, criticizing the clothes I chose, questioning my friendships, and even the college I was attending. What hurt me most was seeing my father condone it, even if silently. He didn't confront her. On the contrary, he reinforced, "Listen to your sister-in-law. She only wants the best for you." I wanted to scream, "This isn't care, it's prison," but my voice wouldn't come. I choked back tears, pretended to agree, and then locked myself in my room, trying to pick up the pieces of my self-esteem. It was around this time that Marta began talking about selling the last possession my mother had left, a small house in the countryside where we spent our vacations when I was a child. For me, that place wasn't just a property. It was a living memory of my mother, of the laughter, the sunny afternoons, the stories told on the porch. Knowing she planned to sell it filled me with a sense of revulsion, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It was as if she wanted to completely erase all trace of my mother, as if the past needed to be destroyed so that only her presence would prevail. I felt that if I did nothing, I would lose my last connection with the only person who had ever made me feel truly loved. That was the first time in a long time that a spark ignited within me. I found myself at a crossroads, remained silent, letting Marta take everything, or finally take a stand. The idea of facing that web of manipulation scared me, but the pain of losing my mother's home was greater. For the first time, it didn't matter if my father would call me ungrateful, if my brother would accuse me of being unfair, or if Marta would try to ridicule me. I knew I had to fight, even if it was alone. That was when my story of overcoming truly began. Still timid, still fragile, but real. I was willing to reclaim my voice, even if it was little by little, even if it was by force. My decision wasn't immediately accompanied by courage. On the contrary, I trembled at the mere thought of the confrontation. For entire nights, I lay awake, pondering how I should react. I relived in my mind every instance of silence, every time I'd swallowed tears and accepted humiliation. Anger began to mix with sadness. It was in this whirlwind of emotions that I realized my greatest weapon was precisely what Marta had always despised in me: my silence. While she talked too much, I observed. While she manipulated, I memorized details. I knew how she worked. I knew where she attacked. I knew when she lied. Suddenly, I realized that what seemed like weakness could be the foundation of my resilience. I started writing everything down in a notebook. Phrases she'd said, situations I'd witnessed, dates, even expressions she'd used. It was my little secret dossier, hidden among my college books. With each entry, I felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself. I was no longer just the victim. I was someone preparing myself. The notebook became silent proof that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't imagination, but real manipulation. And with each page I wrote, I gained a little more strength for the moment I needed to act. But taking action wasn't simple. There were days when I thought about giving up, tearing up that notebook and going back to being the silent Leticia. Fear paralyzed me. And at times, Marta seemed to sense I was changing. She'd look at me more closely, as if sensing I wasn't the same anymore. This made me redouble my caution. Feigning submission became my strategy. I smiled when I wanted to cry, agreed when I wanted to scream, but inside I was building my own resistance. It was a dangerous game, but I no longer had a choice. The tension increased when I discovered by chance that Marta was already in negotiations to sell the house in the countryside. I heard part of a phone call as I passed through the hallway. My heart raced, my hands sweated, and I had the urge to snatch the phone from her hand, but I controlled myself. I took a deep breath and kept walking, as if I hadn't heard anything. Later, in my room, I cried until I couldn't hold my breath anymore. That was the moment I realized I couldn't wait any longer. If I wanted to protect that asset, I had to act fast. The game had changed, and I needed to expose myself. It was then, one silent dawn, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, that I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let Marta destroy my mother's memories. I wouldn't allow her to sell the house. Nor would I allow her to erase our family's history. And above all, I wouldn't accept being silenced anymore. That night marked a turning point. I still didn't know exactly how I would do it, but I knew I had to face it. The pain that had previously paralyzed me was now beginning to move me. It was as if my mother were there with me, holding my hand, saying softly, "Go, daughter. The voice you seek has always been within you." The first step was mental. I needed to convince myself that I could face Marta without losing my cool. I practiced every sentence, every argument, every way of positioning myself in my head. It wouldn't be a shout or an outburst of anger, but a calculated strategy. I began talking to myself in the mirror, rehearsing responses, adjusting my tone of voice, observing my own gaze. With each repetition, I felt a growing courage. I realized that I didn't depend on anyone's approval, not even my father or my brother. I was regaining my autonomy, and this awareness alone gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The second step was to proceed with caution. I scheduled a meeting with my father while Marta was away and began calmly explaining the truth, sharing facts, messages, and records I had jotted down. At first, he was surprised and confused. Some points I raised seemed to remind him of small situations he had already forgotten. Little by little, I began to see doubt emerge in his eyes. That crack in the wall Marta had so skillfully erected. It wasn't easy. I felt the weight of responsibility, but I also felt a growing inner strength, as if each word I spoke freed not only me, but also the truth trapped within. Meanwhile, I had to deal with Marta. She sensed something was up and tried to destabilize me, using the same old tricks: emotional blackmail, irony, petty humiliations. But, unlike before, I didn't give in. I took a deep breath, stood my ground, mentally replayed everything I'd rehearsed, and used my notebook as a guide. With each answer I gave, I felt myself reclaiming my voice, my space, and my decision-making power. It was a tense, almost suffocating, but also liberating moment. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to be myself, even in front of her. The turning point came when my father finally confronted Marta with me. It seemed unlikely, but it happened. He began to see through the manipulations, the lies, the games of self-interest. Marta tried to maintain her composure, but her mask began to slip. The defenses that had previously seemed unbreakable began to crumble, and I could see the truth reflected in my father's eyes. The feeling of relief mixed with triumph was indescribable. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The house, which had previously felt like a prison, was beginning to transform into a space of possibility once again. From that moment on, my life began to change. The struggle wasn't instantaneous or magical, but the first step toward recovery had been taken. I learned that inner strength isn't about not feeling fear or pain, but about recognizing what's wrong, preparing for it, and acting courageously, even when everything seems lost. My relationship with my father improved. My brother began to see things, and Marta lost the control she had over us. And above all, I regained my self-confidence. The feeling of being able to choose my own story was something I hadn't felt in years, and I finally realized that the voice I'd lost inside me had always been there, waiting to be heard. In the months that followed, I realized that the victory wasn't just about Marta or the situation she created, but about myself. Every small step I took to assert myself taught me about resilience, patience, and courage. I started making decisions for myself again, without needing anyone's approval. I began to plan my life clearly: courses, trips, investments in my dreams. The freedom I felt wasn't just physical or material, but something much deeper, almost spiritual. The feeling that I could reconnect with my essence was liberating. For the first time in a long time, I slept without feeling that crushing weight on my chest. My relationship with my father, Celso, underwent a process of reconstruction. He began to see me again, not as a fragile daughter who needed to be protected, but as a woman capable of thinking, making decisions, and fighting for what she believes in. Renato, my brother, though still resistant in some ways, began to realize that Marta's manipulation was neither fair nor natural. We began to talk more openly, sharing feelings that had previously been bottled up. That silent, rigid communication finally gave way to understanding and empathy. I also had to deal with my own scars. Years of accumulating frustrations, fears, and insecurities. I discovered that overcoming doesn't mean erasing the pain, but learning to live with it so it no longer dominates our choices. I began seeking external support, therapy, talking to friends, reading books that helped me understand patterns of manipulation and control. With each insight, I felt stronger, more aware, and more capable of setting boundaries. I learned to put my emotional health first, without guilt or fear of displeasing. Over time, I realized that experience profoundly transformed me. It not only made me more resilient, but also more empathetic. I could recognize signs of manipulation in other relationships, but also see the strength of those, like me, struggling to break free. The pain I felt, though intense, became fuel for my rebuilding. I finally understood that being vulnerable isn't a weakness, but an opportunity to connect with one's essence and transform suffering into learning. Today, looking back, I see that that phase of my life was a turning point. I recovered the voice that had been taken from me, regained my freedom, and became the protagonist of my own story. I still carry painful memories, but they no longer define me. What matters is that I learned to fight for myself, to protect what's mine, and to believe that, even surrounded by betrayal and manipulation, it's possible to rise again. My mother, even physically absent, lives on in my memories and in the strength she left me, and I carry on, strengthened, ready to write the next chapters of my life.